Okay, so let's get started. As you can see here, we have a background and we have the controller itself on two separate layers. I've already cut the controller out to save time. So we'll start by double clicking next to the word controller here on the layer to bring up our layer style dialog. And I'm just going to move this to the side so we can see what we're doing. And I might actually zoom in a little bit just so we can see a little bit more of the shadow detail in a moment. Okay, so go straight down to drop shadow. And this may look different than mine depending on what parameters you last changed in drop shadow, because it does remember the preferences from the previous use. So the first thing to tackle on the drop shadow is the direction of the shadow. So having a quick look at the controller, we can see that the light seems to be coming from the left-hand side, as you can see on this cross pad here. The highlights are on the left-hand side, so we know that we need to adjust our angle accordingly so the shadow is falling on the right side of the product. Something like that's okay to start with. And adjust the distance and the size to taste depending on how far away you want the shadow to be cast. And the size will determine how hard or soft the shadow you get. Just going to do something like that for the moment, just to get us started. Now, the second thing you need to adjust that will really make a difference to your shadows is the color. So if I just put the opacity up to full, and you can see it's just a solid black shadow, which looks awful. No shadow in real life is solid black. So the first thing to change is the color. So we'll click that and bring up the color picker. Now sample from your background color, but then when it appears in the color picker here, as you can see, it's chosen the same color as the background because we've sampled it. Just drag that down to make a darker tone of that background. Click OK. And then we'll change the blend mode to multiply. And that just means it'll interact better with other elements in the shot if you put it onto a different background or if an object goes under the controller or something like that. And of course, you can tweak the color of this, you may desaturate it a little bit, move it up, but we've just put some color into that shadow so it looks a bit more natural. Now, the next tip, and this is one that I don't think many people know about, but it's adjusting the contour. If we just click here at the bottom on the arrow, it brings up some contour presets. And these are different, as you can see, different shaped shadow contours. And I'll go into this in more detail in a moment, but they all have very different effects on the edge of the shadow. And to be honest, none of them look desirable apart from the first one, which is why I'm going to show you how to make a custom one. So to do that, we'll just click on the main contour icon of the flat contour here, just a straight diagonal, and it brings up this curve here, this sort of chart. And how this works is if you drag this up, if you look at the shadow, you can see it's expanding the shadow, but it's also making the edge a little bit harder. And if you pull it down, it will constrict the shadow and soften the edge slightly. So what we can do with this, if you just press backspace, you'll delete any points you've created, is I like to just make a few points just across the line of the curve. And that will then let us change these shadow edge parameters across different tonal areas of the shadow. And what this means in reality is if I move this top one now, if you look at the shadow, it's affecting the edge of the shadow, but it's not affecting the entire of the shadow, just a portion of the tonal range. And as you can see here, just by tweaking a few of these points, you don't have to move them a lot, you can get a lot more realistic shadow with almost like a slight double edge to it, or almost it looks like there's two shadows, making the shadow more complex, therefore making it look a bit more realistic than your generic drop shadow. And this is a lot more how a shadow behaves, especially if there's more than one light source. So if we click OK for that, now we can save this by going back to that icon, go into the little cog and selecting new contour. And we'll call this Shadow Custom. Okay. Now if I flick between that and the generic option that Photoshop defaults to, it's quite subtle, but as you can see, we've just created a slightly less Photoshoppy version of the drop shadow. And it just looks a little bit more realistic, and you can experiment with this and you can push things even more if you want it to be really obvious, and you can add more points, and you can, now it's starting to break apart too much and it's starting to look a bit strange. So we'll just delete a couple of these, retweak them, Actually going to go back to how it was. So now you've got all those elements, we can go to styles and we can create new style, call it shadow, and then we've saved that style in case we need to come back. Now there's one final thing we can do here to add more flexibility to our enhanced drop shadow, and that is to split it out into a separate layer. So if you right click on the layer style in the layer itself, it will come up with this option and you can click create layer. Now what that will do, if you can see, it's rasterized that shadow into its own layer, which means you can now move it around and manipulate it any way you like. So some things you might want to do with this is transform the shadow. You might want to stretch it, or you may wish to warp it if you've got it on an uneven surface, or you want it looking like it's slanted, or the shadows, if you've got a irregular shaped object, you can then adjust the shadow to match the contact points of the object itself. And like here, just by warping it, it's almost made it look like it's on a sloped surface. But I'll just undo that. And you can also do things like doubling it up. So press Command J to duplicate it, and then transform it, just shrink it down a bit. You can just bring a little element of it in. Again, you can warp that to just tuck it a bit more out the way. And then again, you can drop the opacity right down and just bring a little bit of it in. And again, you've got that little bit of extra interest for a more realistic shadow effect.